This is the Cregagh colony, ex-servicemen's colony built for veterans of the Great War, occupied by veterans and their families right up to the current century. One of the things which is said about the Cregagh colony is that it was built in the form of the Union flag. It's not. You can see that it's clearly not. It's more like the South African flag, if anything. Another common myth that I've seen is that it was built for veterans of the Ulster Division. It was not. It was built for veterans, whether they were airmen, seamen, or soldiers. And the units with which they served were irrelevant. I think that idea has developed because all the streets are named after battles in which the Ulster Division fought. But I think that's more of a coincidence than any relationship thing. I'm frequently going to be referring to either the ISSLT or the Trust. And those are both alternatives for the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust, which is the organisation that built these houses and 1,252 houses for ex-servicemen across Northern Ireland between 1921 and 1939. More houses were built after the Second World War, but the numbers were drastically reduced compared to the interwar period. The ISSLT was provided with money to build the houses by the British government, and the houses were built not only in Northern Ireland but also in the Irish Free State. The largest colony in Ireland, on the island of Ireland, is in Dublin, and it's called Colester Garden Village, and it has 289 properties. This colony, which is the term I use, this community, this area, this estate, whatever you want to call it, has 146. So the one down in Dublin is almost twice the size. This is a 17-acre parcel of land which was purchased from the Marquis of Downshire for just over £2,000. In today's terms, that would be £120,686, or £7,000 per acre. Now, if you were a builder and you were buying a parcel of land, a 1 acre parcel of land to build on, you would not get it for 7,000 quid. You'd be probably talking 100,000 quid for 1 acre. So that gives an idea that the Marquis of Downshire, when he sold the land for the building of these cottages, houses, he was reducing the price that he was charging, and he was in all likelihood doing that as a part of commemoration. And that's the same thing which you find happening across Northern Ireland. Landowners were selling land, but they were selling it way, way, way below its market value because they saw it as being an act of commemoration or an act of memory. So there was a proposal to construct 146 cottages, was accepted by the Castlereagh Rural District Council in October 1923. As I said, this was to become the largest colony of ex-servicemen houses built in Northern Ireland. There's a lot of isolated cottages which were built in ones and twos across the province, but there were also several other what we could call colonies. Principal ones being Massines Park in Londonderry and Shantallow, two at White Abbey called Ypres Park and Cambrai Park, and one at Glengormley called St Quintin Park. There's smaller ones in Bangor called Arras Park, and in Strabane called Courtrai Court. And there's a few others, but on Finicky there's one which is 40 houses. So this, at 146, this is the largest colony. Clearance and preparation on the site commenced in August 1921, but the construction work did not start until 1923 because of the negotiations with the council. The original application was rejected by the council because there were too few houses, and they decided that the gardens were too small to be market gardens but too large to be residential gardens. And there was a couple of other things. The width of the road that had been designated in the plans was too narrow, so the council was thinking forward. We're not dealing with horses and carts, we're now dealing with maybe motorised transport, so we want roads to be wider. The construction was completed by the end of 1925, and the 1926 Belfast street directories, you start to see the streets having occupants. It was fully occupied by the end of 1926. So in the 1927 street directory, there's a registered occupant for every house in this colony, this community. These houses were some of the first to be designed specifically by the ISSLT, and it was the chief architect for the government of Northern Ireland, Roland Ingleby Smith, who actually designed these houses. And they are fairly unique. You'll find similar ones to this in Ypres Park in Cambrai, and I think there's some up, the rural versions that are up in Ballymoney. But in 1924-25, these were the styles of houses that were being built. There are 3 different house types, house styles in this area. You've got 28 type W1 houses. The house immediately in front of us is a type 1, or that pair, and you can see it's been extended sideways. And if you look just below the windows, you can see there's a concrete lintel, and then it suddenly stops. That's where that electricity cable or telephone cable is. That was the extent of the original house. This is a type 2, W2 house. And then you had the type W3, which were built in blocks of 4. So there's 28 of the type W1, 38 of the W2, and 80 of the W3. All the houses had the same basic layout, but there were some differences. Although they all had the same basic facilities, there were some differences. The floor area for the type W1 and W2 houses was 756 square feet and 757. So 1 square foot of a difference. And if you look at that house and then look at that house, you can see that it's really just the shape of the windows and the location of the windows that distinguishes them from the outside. The type W3 houses, which are the blocks of 4, obviously you've got the internal houses, and they were actually smaller than the external house. And the internal ones had a floor area of 756, and the outside houses in a block of 4 had 779 square feet, and they had a driveway access. So for the people living in the interior houses, they had to cart coal and everything else, the bins, through the house. The ground floor of each house had a living room, a scullery kitchen, a larder room, and a fuel storage area. So basically under the stairs was where you kept your coal and your peat and your logs. Although most occupants would have got an outside coal bunker built, and then would have used the understairs for normal storage, for storage of household goods, like so many people still do. If you've got trouble finding where to put something, bucket under the stairs. Interestingly, all these houses had interior plumbing, baths, and flushing toilets. And for a lot of the men that originally lived here, it was probably the first time they'd lived in a house which had interior plumbing, where they could turn on a tap and they got water without going to a well or going to a tap. On the first floor, each house had 3 bedrooms. The initial rent was 10 shillings per week, and that equates to £30 per week in current terms. Now, can you imagine getting a semi-detached house with 3 bedrooms and paying rent of 30 quid a week in current today? You'd be lucky to be paying 300 quid. And that's because the rents were kept artificially low. And they were kept artificially low because the purpose of the rents was to provide the resources for the trust to continue the maintenance of the properties. So the men that moved into these houses were tenants. They did not own the houses. Although they were, so long as they paid their rent, they would stay in possession. But the trust wanted to have a reserve of money so that if there was a fire, they could come in and repair the houses. Every 2 or 3 years, you'll see that most of the houses here are painted white on the outside. Originally, all these houses would have been white. I'm surprised they didn't call it White City. So all the houses would have been white, and every 2 or 3 years, the trust would come round and they would repaint all the houses. So there was a uniformity, and you get the same in the other areas where these houses were built. Cambrai Park, Ypres Park, St. Quentin, Aris Park, they were all painted white originally. You now have different shades coming in, but you can still see that predominantly the houses are painted white. Alexander Hogg, who was one of Belfast's premier photographers in the late 19th century, early 20th century, He was commissioned to take photographs of the colony during its construction. That's taken from roughly this position, because you can see the curve that runs around the front of the war memorial there. And there's a railway track came in to bring in the building materials, and it was connected up to the tramway, which terminated just up near where the House of Orange is now. So what's now the bus terminus was originally the tram terminus. And so they had a wee railway built, which enabled bricks, mortar, all that sort of stuff to be transported in where it was needed. Another of the photographs, the second one, shows a steam engine, and that was located at Somme Drive, looking down Thiepval Avenue. It's breaking up rocks and stones to be used as the base for the streets. The third photograph, some completed houses, and you will see that it was the law in the 1920s that if you took a photograph in a public street, you had to have urchins in it. Okay? That was the law. You had to have an urchin. We have the War Memorial, which is the Cregagh and District War Memorial. I'll talk about that briefly at the very end of the tour. But I want to talk about first about 26 Picardy Avenue, which is the house on our left if you're facing those houses. Now you can see those two houses, as I said, one has been drastically extended, but the other from the outside and from the front is almost exactly as it was back when these houses were built in 1925. One of the main differences is the windows back in 1925 all had small panes, and there were metal dividers between each pane. Those have largely been taken out. The first occupant of this house was Adam Hamilton, and he was born near Temple Patrick on 21st January 1886 to Alexander Hamilton and Catherine Williamson, and the family had moved to the Shankill area by 1901. Adam was a labourer in the Belfast Corporation Gasworks, Ormo Road, and was living at Bootle Street when he married Grace Dempsey of Bristol Street on 22nd August 1914 in what was then St Anne's Parish Church, now St Anne's Cathedral. Adam and Grace had one daughter when Adam enlisted with the 14th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles on 14 September 1914. He was deployed to France in October 15, and on the 17th of June 1916 he was admitted to the 110th Field Ambulance with severe burns on his left leg. Transferred to number 18 ambulance train the following day. He was serving with 2nd Battalion when he sustained gunshot wounds to the throat and neck on 23rd July 1918 and was admitted to number 62 Casualty Clearing Station the following day. He was transferred to a base hospital on 25th July and evacuated to UK by hospital ship on the 11th of August. He was serving with the 3rd Reserve Battalion in September 1918 when an X-ray revealed that a fragment of metal was embedded in the muscle at the base of his tongue. Now, if anyone has ever suffered from mouth ulcers, you know how annoying they can be. Can you imagine having a wee bit of metal right at the back of your jaw? It would be a constant irritant. The doctor concluded that operating represented a significant risk of greater damage being done. So basically, Adam Hamilton spent the rest of his life with this wee bit of metal stuck at the back of his jaw. He was living at Fortingale Street off the Old Lodge Road when he was discharged to the Class Z Army Reserve on 13th February 1919, and he was awarded a 40% disablement pension at the rate of 16 shillings per week, plus an allowance of 7 shillings per week for one child. A pension of 23 shillings in 1920 would be the equivalent of £56 per week for spending 4 years on the Western Front, and he ends up with 56 quid a week. Wouldn't even keep you in fags for a week, for those of you who smoke, or drink for those of you who drink, or coffee for those of you who drink coffee, covering all the bases. Adam Hamilton's name is recorded on the Belfast Corporation Gas Department Roll of Honour, which is located in Belfast City Hall. He died at Belfast City Hospital on 27th December 1954, aged 68, and the property transferred to Grace Hamilton, who died on 10th December 1975, aged 83. Adam and Grace are buried in Carnmoney Cemetery, along with their infant daughter, also called Grace, who died at the age of 3 in February 1923. The house passed to Reggie Hamilton, their son, and he was still living in that house in 2018. But basically that house stayed in the one family for over 100 years. How many people here have lived in a house that's been in their family for 100 years? None of us, because we tend to move more. But also because there was an element of pride at living in an ex-serviceman's house. Okay, we're going to move down Bapalm Avenue, and then we're going to come across the front of what's now Montgomery Road, and then up on Picardy Avenue. Bapalm Avenue, 25 houses were built here, and numbers 14 and 16, which are immediately behind me, are a pair of Type W2 cottages. And as you can see, they're virtually unchanged from the front. There may well be extensions at the back. Internally, houses or walls may have been knocked down and rooms converted into one room. The first occupant of number 14 was Leslie Hammond, who was born on 15th July 1892 at Townhead Street. His parents were Andrew Hammond, who was a sawyer, and Sarah Clark. Leslie Hammond was a shipyard labourer in Belfast when he enlisted with the Royal Navy on 26th October 1915 for the duration of the war, or the duration of hostilities as it had on the form. He was serving on HMS Diligence when he was demobilised on 4th March 1919, and he was a tram driver when he married Annie Lamont on 18th February 1926. So basically when he came out of the house in the morning, he had a 5-minute walk to the terminus, jumped on a tram, and he's away. Bob's your uncle. Their first child, Matilda Jane, died when she was 3 weeks old on 25th October 1927. So she's probably the earliest death within the colony. But I haven't looked at every house yet, so there could be others who died earlier. And she was buried in Belfast City Cemetery. Leslie Hammond died on 13th May 1962 at Bapalm Avenue. And he's buried in the same plot as his daughter in Belfast City Cemetery. So we're going to move to the end of Bapalm Avenue. With the concentration of ex-servicemen in this area, it's not surprising that they formed their own branch of the British Legion. And a hall was built outside the boundary of the colony and across the road from the end of Bapalm Avenue. So if you look down to my left, your right, that grey building is the Legion Hall. Originally, the Legion Hall was probably a wooden hut or an ex-army hut. It was. Several of the other colonies had Legion huts or halls built just outside them. Messines Park in Derry had a Legion Hall just outside the boundary, and Cambria Park in White Abbey, the White Abbey British Legion Hall was built just outside the boundary. But in Colester, and I keep coming back to Colester because I've been doing a lot of work on it recently, in Colester there was a Legion Hall in the middle of the community, and it became part of the community, became a community centre. It was used for parties, it was used for Christmas parties, it was used for shows and whatnot. So it was an integral part of their community. Another big difference between Colester and anything in Northern Ireland is that it was built as a village, as a garden village. So there were large areas of green space within the community where kids could play safely and so forth. But they had a Legion hut on the premises, and it's still there. At the minute, it's not being used for anything, and the local community down there are trying to get something done to be able to start using that facility again. It was last owned by a mixed martial arts group for self-defense classes. Okay, we're going to move along. Back in 1926, this was Bell's Lane. It's now Montgomery Road, named after Field Marshal Montgomery. And it became Montgomery Road in the 1950s, I think. So these houses were originally called had the address Bell's Lane. Okay, I'm going to work from 4 down to 1. The original occupant of this house was William Blair McFarlane, who worked for the Customs and Excise. And the second occupant was Gavin Agnew, a joiner, and he had moved in at the end of the 1950s. William had enlisted with the Military Foot Police in 1904 and served in the Western Front and with the Egyptian Expeditionary Force in the Near East during the Great War. He died at home in December 1957, aged 76. The second house along, which has Rue de Sarge, so I'm not sure whether there was a sergeant lived there or whether it's just an affectation. Samuel Nelson was the original occupant, and he served with the 8th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles from 9th September 1914 to 14th December 1918. He died at his home on 23rd February 1932, aged 48, so still quite a young man. And his wife Sarah was living on the Beersbridge Road when she died on 4th February 1969, aged 82. Samuel and Sarah Nelson are buried in Dundonald Cemetery. Charles Sproul, a postman, occupied cottage number 3, which is where that red house number is, just beyond that lovely shade of colour for the Beetle, or for the Mini. He was a postman, and he occupied the cottage from 1926 to about 1931. James McMaster was listed as the occupant in 1932 when the ISSLT carried out a rent revaluation. Charles Sproul sustained gunshot wounds to the head in 1916, and it's important to remember that gunshot wounds to the head. While serving with 1st Battalion Royal Irish Rifles, he was taken prisoner at Albert and spent over 30 months as a prisoner of war. When discharged, he had over 21 years service with the Royal Irish Rifles, and he had over 16 years service with the post office, when he stole a registered package destined for the Northern Bank in April 1939. The package contained £3,000 in crisp £1 notes. That, in today's terms, is 158,169 quid. It was being sent from Lloyds Bank to the Northern Bank, and Charles received a sentence of 6 months imprisonment without hard labour. And I think partially the reason why the judge gave him a lenient sentence is the bulk of the £3,000 was recovered, but he spent the remainder going on a drinking spree. But also he took into account that he was a war veteran and he'd been wounded in the head. So we don't know what caused him to have this aberration, but it did result in him being imprisoned for 6 months. The house at the very end, the first occupant was Edward McNary, and he was born around 1880 at Barrow-in-Furness in Lancashire to James McNary, a joiner, and Catherine McNary, formerly Duncan. The family had moved back to Ireland by 1891, and the family home was at Bright Street in Pottinger District in 1901. Edward was a tailor when he enlisted with the Royal Field Artillery on 19th March 1900. He was a bombardier and stationed at Kildare when he married Kathleen McAvoy of Mountjoy Square on 4th January 1905 at St George's Church of Ireland in Dublin. He was deployed to France on 30th May 1915 and served with 62nd Brigade. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, one step down from the Victoria Cross, in January 1918 for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. He rendered good and meritorious service and had set a splendid example in carrying out whatever task had been allotted to him under varied conditions of danger and difficulty. He was reported as wounded in the casualty lists dated 16th January 1918 and again in the casualty list dated 13th May 1918. Edward was a sergeant tailor when he was discharged on 18th March 1922, having served with the British Army for 22 years. Kathleen McNary died on 23rd December 1944, aged 64, and Edward was a retired civil service messenger and living at 27 Ryan Park in Castlereagh, which was the home of his daughter Margaret, when he died of bronchopneumonia at Belfast City Hospital on 3rd January 1968 at the age of 87. So those are the 4 houses. They don't have battle names, but they're part of the Cregagh colony. We're going to walk down this way and then take the first left onto Picardy Avenue. This is Picardy Avenue, and there were 29 houses built on this short avenue. Number 10 behind us is a centre house in a Type W3 block. James Mackay was the first occupant, and he was born on 1st January 1890 at Glenallen Street, So not that far away from here. He was born just down the Cregagh Road. His parents were Thomas Mackay and Jane McBurney, and the family was living at Tower Street in 1901. Tower Street, for those of you who don't know, is off the Lower Newtonards Road. He was a labourer when he joined the Royal Navy as a stoker on 11th April 1907 for a 12-year engagement. And 12 years was the standard engagement period for both the Army and the Royal Navy. And it was generally split that you did five years with the regular forces, and then you were on the reserve for 7 years. Some people, when they got to the end of the 5 years, they opted to continue in service with the regulars rather than going into the reserves. Having served for 5 years, he transferred to the Royal Fleet Reserve on 13th April 1912, and he was recalled to active service on 13th July 1914. It's interesting that the Army didn't call up reservists until the 4th of August, but the Navy tended to call up reservists in July. Whether that's because they were holding manoeuvres that just happened to coincide with near the start of the First World War, or whether they had more of an inkling than the War Office, I shall not pass comment on that. Joseph was serving on HMS Diligence when he was discharged on 24th February 1919. He had married Sarah Boyd on 18th March 1916 whilst on leave, and they were married at Albert Bridge Congregational Church. Sarah Mackey died at Picardy Avenue on 25th January 1961, aged 75, and Joseph was still living at Picardy Avenue when he died on 26th September 1977, aged 87. Both are buried in the Glenalina extension at Belfast City Cemetery. So this is Picardy Avenue, again a mixture, and you can see that some of the houses are set back a bit. So for example, these two pairs of semi-detached houses are set further back, and that's just to break up the line of the avenue a bit more. All of these houses had large gardens, about 0.12 of an acre, but also in the area behind the houses there was open land which was generally used as allotments, and we'll see where there's still currently allotments in Albert Drive later on. Sorry, Albert Drive later on. Okay, Hamel Drive. The streets that ran across Steeple Avenue were all called drives. So you have Hamel Drive, Albert Drive, and then Somme Drive at the very top of the estate. 18 houses were built. 2 of the type W1 houses on Hamel Drive, number 6 and 8, basically where we are now, were demolished to facilitate the construction of this sheltered accommodation called Hamel Court, which was built by the Miliband Trust. The Miliband Trust had become the agents of the ISSLT in the 1960s. In this area in here, 16 flats were built at a cost of £216,000. And the block was officially opened by Mr. Don Concannon. Do you remember Don Concannon? Labour Party, I think. And he was the Minister of State for Health and Social Services in the direct rule government. The site also houses the offices of the Miliband Trust, which administered the ex-servicemen's houses across Northern Ireland. The object of the Miliband Trust is to provide accommodation for elderly people with limited means, particularly those from a services background. So they're still providing the same sort of service, but in a different way. Back in the 1920s, they were putting families into houses. Now they're providing for elderly veterans, men who are maybe finding life more difficult, and they're providing sheltered accommodation. There's a similar sheltered accommodation scheme over at Cambrai Park in White Abbey, and a block of about 12 small houses have been built at St. Quintin Park, and they've been built only in the last 4 or 5 years. A tragedy occurred at number 8 Hamel Drive in 1939. Private Joseph Huddart of the Border Regiment was stationed at Palace Barracks when he married Mary Mann in December 1934. So Mary's parents occupied number 8 Hamel Drive. On Saturday 8th August, so it's 1936, The Northern Whig reported that Joseph and his 18-month son were rescued from the house after becoming unconscious due to gas fumes. Joseph died at Purdysburn Mental Hospital on 16th August 1936, aged 21. At the coroner's inquiry, James Forsyth of number 7 Thiepval Avenue gave evidence that his son alerted him that, quote, Joe Huddart was gassing himself. And James Forsyth found Joe with his head in the gas oven in the kitchen, with the gas turned on fully. He was treated at the Royal Victoria Hospital before being transferred to the military hospital in Palace Barracks on 11th August. On Saturday, 15th August, he was examined by Dr. Norman Graham and transferred to the mental hospital, where he died of the effects of coal gas poisoning whilst temporarily insane. The first occupant was Albert Gribben, who was born on 26th March 1881 at Ballyvicknakelly. Anyone know where Ballyvicknakelly is? It's near Dromore in County Down. And his parents were William Gribben, who was a weaver, and Sarah Hutchison. He was living at Devonshire Street in the Lower Falls when he married Margaret Thompson, also of Dromore, on 21st September 1902 at St Anne's Parish Church. In 1911, Albert and Margaret and their 5 children were living at Sherwood Street in the Ormo Road, and Albert was employed as a motorman. He enlisted with 5th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles on 17th August 1914 and held the rank of Lance Corporal. When he was posted to 6th Battalion, part of the 10th Irish Division in Salonika in October 1915. In September 1917, the Belfast Evening Telegraph reported that he had been hospitalised with heat stroke. Lance Sergeant Albert Gribben was discharged as being no longer physically fit for war service due to blindness on 18th April 1918. He was awarded a constant attendant allowance and was living at Sherwood Street when he was awarded a supplementary pension of 10 shillings per week in respect of quinine poisoning. Albert was a bootmaker after the war, which, if you're blind, must be particularly dangerous. One wrong move and you've lost a thumb or a finger. He died on 8th August 1943, aged 62, and is buried in Dromore Cathedral graveyard. A death notice was placed by Ballyvicknakelly LOL 18828, of which Albert was a member. His widow was still living at number 2 Hamill Drive when she died on 26th July 1953, aged 70. Across the road where that red brick house is now located, or houses, was the local grocery store, 1A Hamill Drive, and it was run by William Pullman and Elizabeth Cuthbert Pullman. William died in March 1939 and Elizabeth continued to run the shop into the 1950s. In 1960, the shop was called Hamill Cash Stores and was run by a Gilbert Wilson. So on site they had their local grocery store, and when it says it was a grocery store, it probably was a bit like the shop in Open All Hours, where it had everything. So we're going to walk back and have a look at a couple of the houses on Thiepval Avenue. Folks, thanks for hanging on in with us here. Behind us we have 2 of the 32 cottages or houses that were built on Thiepval Avenue. ISSLT refers to all their properties as cottages, but to me these do not look like what I would call cottages. They're houses, but you take your money and whatever else. So number 25 and 27 are type W2 houses. The first occupant of 25 Thiepval Avenue was Edwin Bothwell, who was born at Avon Street in June 1892 to James Bothwell and Mary Stevenson. In 1911, the family was living at Ribble Street, Lower Newtonhards Road, and Edwin was employed in one of Belfast's shipyards as a rivet heater. He could have been employed at Workman Clark or at the other one, can't remember the name of it. Built a big ship that sank. I did that at a talk once and somebody took offence because they worked at Harland and Wolff. Oops. Anyway, Edwin Bothwell enlisted with the 16th, 2nd Birkenhead Battalion of the Cheshire Regiment. And now that I see that, it leads me to suppose that he worked for Harland and Wolff, because Harland and Wolff owned a shipyard at Birkenhead. So he was probably on secondment or had been transferred to the Harrington Wolff shipyard at Birkenhead. He enlisted on 24th November 1914, but was not deployed to France until after 31st December 1915. It's probable that he was employed at Harrington Wolff shipyard in Birkenhead and enlisted with the local regiment rather than coming back to Belfast. He was serving with the Labour Corps when he was discharged due to wounds on 12th December 1917, aged 25. And he was living at the family home in Batley Street when he was awarded a 30% disablement pension at the rate of 12 shillings per week, approximately £30 per week in current terms. Edwin Bothwell married Bella Emerson on 14th December 1921 at Clifton Street Presbyterian Church. That church no longer exists, having been destroyed by the German bombers in April 1941. The Bothwells lived at 25 Thiepval Avenue until at least 1950, but then moved round the corner into at number 2 Albert Drive by 1960. Edwin Bothwell died on 21st December 1962, aged 70, and is buried in Dundonald Cemetery. Isabella Bothwell, who is a member of the women's section of the Cregagh branch of the Royal British Legion, was living at 2 Albert Drive when she died on 23rd November 1975, and she's buried in the graveyard at Clough Presbyterian Church in County Down. So we're going to head down Albert Drive. 18 houses were built here. The ones on this side of Thiepval Avenue are semi-detached. The ones on the far side are blocks of 4. The first occupant of the house behind us, number 1, was Robert Foulis, and he was born on 23rd March 1888 at Perry Street to John Foulis and Georgina Service. He was a labourer living at Henry Street when he married Jane Little from Nelson Street on 21st December 1910 at St Anne's Parish Church. Robert Foulis was living at Baskin Street and was an engine driver with the Belfast and County Down Railway. If you look at the caption to that photograph, you'll see that nearly all the family were railwaymen. So he enlisted with the Royal Engineers on 16th November 1914. He was in training with 121st Field Company when he was promoted to Sergeant in June 1915 and deployed to France with the Ulster Division in October 1915. He was admitted to number 12 Casualty Clearing Station on 12th January 1917, suffering from shell shock, and was transferred to number 4 Stationary Hospital before being discharged back to duties on 8th February. He was then transferred from a field company to the Railways Operations Division in July 1917. Obviously, with his occupation and trade, it made more sense. He held the rank of Company Quartermaster Sergeant when he was transferred to the Class Z Army Reserve on 25th April 1919. Class Z Army Reserve, for those of you who are not familiar with that military terminology, was a class of the Army Reserve which meant that if war broke out again, if the peace negotiations collapsed, they were liable for immediate recall to active service. And basically that continued until the middle of 1920, when anyone who was on the Class Z Army Reserve was then reclassified as demobilised. Robert's occupation in the Belfast Street Directory is recorded as driver, but we can assume that that means he was an engine driver rather than the driver of a bus or some sort of vehicle. He was no longer the occupant in 1939. Robert Foulis died at William Street in Donaghadee on 23rd June 1946, aged 58, and is buried in the graveyard at Donaghadee Parish Church. So some of the men, when they got close to retirement age or whatever, they maybe decided, right, I want to move to the seaside, down to the Dee, and had a nice wee house down there. Going to go back to Thiepval Avenue, turn right, and we'll go into Somme Drive. Number 3, Somme Drive, which is the next house along. I've stopped at the wrong one again. W3 house. The first occupant was Alexander Hay, who was born in Scotland around 1896. His father was also called Alexander and was a plumber, and his mother was Mary Jane Campbell. His father was born in Scotland, and his mother was born in County Sligo. The family was living at Cable Street in 1911. Alexander Hay enlisted with the Royal Irish Rifles and was deployed to France with 10th Battalion in October 1915. He was stationed at Salisbury Plain when he married Agnes Helen McCulloch of Rosebery Street on 27th July 1918 at Willowfield Parish Church. There was a major military hospital at Salisbury Plain, so it's quite probable that he had been wounded or taken ill, and he was receiving treatment at the hospital when he nipped back over to Belfast to get married. He was serving with 1st Battalion when he was transferred to the Class Z Army Reserve on 25th March 1919. After the war, Alexander worked as a plumber, and at one stage he was Secretary of the Cregagh branch, British Legion. Following a visit to the Cregagh colony by Lady Haig, he wrote to Captain C. Herbert Crichton, Belfast branch, British Legion, "I have been instructed by the committee of the above branch to request that you convey through your council to Lady Craig the best wishes, Lady Haig, the best thanks of their members for the interest she took in the housing of ex-servicemen in Northern Ireland on her too brief visit. We believe that her influence and appeal to Lord Dufferin on the means of the trust granting a reduction in rent from 1st July 1929. So in 1929, the guys living here were having difficulty paying the rent. Lady Haig paid a visit and they buttonholed her and said, raise this with the guys in charge, and as a result, the rents were reduced. We trust that this request will be forwarded to her ladyship without delay and an invitation extended to visit Northern Ireland at her earliest convenience. A son, Gordon Alexander Hay, enlisted with 2nd Battalion Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers in 1938 at the age of 18 and then transferred to the Royal Army Ordnance Corps in 1940. He served in India and Burma and was mentioned in dispatches. He was demobilised with the rank of Warrant Officer First Class. Agnes Hay died at number 3 Somme Drive on 28th April 1965, aged 69, and is buried in the McCulloch plot in Dundonald Cemetery. Another son, David Hay, was heavily involved with the Dundonald Junior Football League, and he was living at number 3 Somme Drive in 1988. So there's another example where we have one family living at number 3 Somme Drive for 100 years plus, which is an indication of how well built these houses were. And believe me, they were well built. I remember I visited one down in Enniskillen, and the family had decided to remove an interior wall to make two small rooms into a large room. And they thought, I'll just be plasterboard and lathe or whatever. It was solid brick. And they kept one of the bricks because it had the maker emblazoned on it. And it was a company from Perth in Scotland, I think. So these houses were very well built, and they were very well maintained by the Trust. And I think the Milliburn Trust still owns a few properties in Northern Ireland, but it's probably a handful or a dozen or whatever. Number 2, Thiepval Avenue behind us. And as you can see, this the end house has been extended to double its original size. But unlike a lot of the other extensions, you can see that distinctive end piece has been retained. So if you look at the house immediately behind us, you can see that it's there, but it's hobbled together a bit. But that's what makes these houses distinctive, is that wee bit where it's cut back. I don't know what the purpose of that is, but there you go. Thomas Foreman, who was the original occupant of this number 2 Thiepval Avenue. The leases for these properties said that you were not allowed to keep livestock. But it was totally ignored. There were people living here in the 1920s and they had chickens, they had goats, some of them had horses, especially if they were working as a carter or a delivery man. They kept the horses on site because they had 0.1 of an acre of a garden where the horse could live, could stay out. Anyway, you can correct me if I get any of this information wrong, and please do feel free to do so. Thomas Foreman was the original occupant of number 2 Thiepval Avenue, and the house stayed in the family until 2004 when his daughter-in-law died. So that's what I've been found anyway, but I may be wrong. Thomas Foreman was born 17th September 1887 at Knockbracken to Samuel Foreman, who was a farmer, and Mary Martin. Although he emigrated to Canada, leaving Belfast on board SS Lake Champlain on 9th May 1907, he was living at Farnham Street when he married Mary Irvine from University Street on 21st August 1916 at the Belfast Registry Office. A few weeks later, he enlisted in the North Irish Horse on 16th October 1916. On 20th September 1917, he was transferred to the 9th Service Battalion of the Royal Irish Fusiliers, which was renamed as the 9th North Irish Horse Battalion. Private Foreman was captured at Lavarguer on 27th March 1918 during the German Spring Offensive, also known as the Battle of St. Quentin. He had sustained injuries to his left arm. He was held at POW camps at Limburg, Darmstadt and Hamburg for the remainder of the war. He was discharged due to a war-related sickness on 5th July 1919. Thomas was living at Knockbracken when he was awarded a 20% disablement pension in respect of a heart condition. The pension rate was 18 shillings per week, plus an allowance of 4 shillings and 8pence for a wife and 2 children. The weekly pension of 22 shillings and 8pence in 1920 would be approximately £55 per week in current terms. And that's to help him to maintain a wife and 2 children, plus whatever children were born after he received the pension, because they wouldn't have had any entitlement. Thomas worked on the trams after the war and died on 15th August 1945, and Mary Foreman died on 21st January 1971. Both are buried in Knockbracken Reformed Presbyterian Church graveyard. Their son Tom and his wife Lily later took over the house, and possession remained, as I said, until Lily's death in 2004. Is that about right? That's correct. Brilliant. Not too far off. Okay, we're going to finish off background at the War Memorial. November 1933, a new Orange Lodge was established as part of Belfast No. 6 district, and it met at Albert Bridge Orange Hall. The lodge was made up largely from veterans of the Great War, some of whom lived in the colony here. It was called the Cregagh Defenders Lodge No. 1588. The lodge's banner was unfurled by John Miller Andrews, Minister of Labour, at the Cregagh War Memorial in July 1934. On one side it features Parliament buildings and the Carson statue, and on the other side it features a representation of the Cregagh War Memorial. The lodge had over 100 members. The newspapers say 100 ex-servicemen members, but I'm not sure that they were all ex-servicemen at the time. By July 1935, so within a year and a half, 100 members. And they had over 200 members by February 1937. So within just over 3 years, the lodge had a membership of 200 plus people. The lodge held an annual Messines Memorial Service at Cregagh Methodist Church on the Sunday nearest to 7th June for a number of years. I don't know whether that persists. No. But it's unusual that they chose to have an annual church service on the 7th of June. Most lodges would go for 1st July. And I think possibly the reason is that some of the founder members had been at Messines, and it meant more to them. It's also possible that they chose Messines because that's one occasion when it's one of the few battles of the Great War where there was a clear-cut win for the Allies. Whereas the likes of the Somme offensive campaign, it petered out and nobody really won. Nobody really was victorious in that campaign. Turning to the next page and that's a photograph that was taken. I'm not sure when it was taken, but every time I look at it, my eye is drawn to that wee girl poking her head through the between two of the men. It goes back to what I was saying. There has to be an urchin in every photograph. This is the Cregagh War Memorial. Cregagh District War Memorial. I've seen it referred to as the Bapalm Avenue War Memorial, although I don't see that it's any more on Bapalm Avenue than it's on Picardy Avenue or Thiepval Avenue. It was erected, this is a more modern plaque on it, but it was erected to the fallen comrades of the men who lived here. So it was a memorial for the men from the Cregagh district who died in the Great War. According to local newspapers, 2,000 people gathered around this war memorial on the 10th of November 1929 to witness the unveiling of the Celtic Cross Memorial that commemorates those from the Cregagh district who fell in the Great War. The unveiling was performed by the Right Honourable John Miller Andrews, who had also unfurled the Lodge banner. And his younger brother Thomas was the managing director of Harnden Wolff, and he perished in the sinking of RMS Titanic. Amongst the numerous wreaths that were laid, and by the way, John Miller Andrews later became the second Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Amongst the numerous wreaths laid were ones by the Willowfield Unionist Club, which was down on the corner. Oh, what's? Sorry? No, it's way down Stockman's Road or Sorry, Cherryville Street. Yeah, it's gone now. It was burnt down in the 1980s, and their war memorial tablet was lost in that, or it was removed and is in somebody's loft. So the Willowfield Unionist Club, but also various youth organisations laid wreaths, Boy Scouts, etc., including one to represent the Boys Brigade. You'll see a photograph of a soldier, and you'll see a photograph of a young boy, teenager, in his Boys Brigade uniform and wearing the medals that were awarded to his father posthumously. Master Robert Haldane of Templemore Street was one of the two lads who laid the Boys Brigade wreath on that date in 1929. And if you're wondering why they held the unveiling on the 10th of November 1929, that's because the Belfast cenotaph was being unveiled and dedicated on the 11th of November. So they wanted to make sure that they got in first, basically. Robert is wearing the 3 service medals awarded to his father, Rifleman Robert Haldane of the 8th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles, who had been killed in action. Guess what date he was killed in action? 2nd July 1916, which is why we're holding the tour today and not yesterday and not next week. These things don't happen by chance. I organise things. When he died, he left a widow, Jessie, and 7 children, Robert being the youngest of those children. Rifleman Robert Haldane is commemorated on the War Memorial in Cregagh Methodist Church. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings this tour to a close. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. I'm going to head up the road to a coffee shop if anyone wants to join me.